All right. At number 3, I have the 2017 Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Eagles, coming into the 2017 season, they were definitely primed to win the Super Bowl. They had retooled their team, and they definitely had the team that definitely could win the Super Bowl. They had Carson Wentz, who was ascended into a superstar in the NFL. Also, they had a great defense that was anchored by dudes like Malcolm Jenkins, as well as Fletcher Cox, who I think was underrated and should have got more props than what he did. But also, they had a great offensive line anchored by the center Jason Kelsey, the right tackle Lane Johnson. Also had a tight end in Zach Ertz. And also, they made some upgrades during the offseason, signing veteran wide receivers at Alshon Jeffrey, as well as Super Bowl champion Torrey Smith, as well as another Super Bowl champ in Chris Long. Yes, he's the son of Hall of Famer Howie Long. And also Long's running mate from New England and LeGarrette Blount, the running back. So the Eagles definitely were very primed to win a Super Bowl with the moves that they made and also the draft picks that they acquired. In 2000 regular season, they were off to a very dominant start as they won 8 out of their first 9 games heading into the bye week. And they had a lot of dominating wins. And they looked like that they were definitely headed towards a very dominant season. Carson Wentz was looking like an MVP candidate. Matter of fact, he was one of the favorites to win MVP that year. But unfortunately, the game of football ends up rearing its ugly head as Carson Wentz suffered a season-ending injury on the road against the Rams in Week 14, and they had to rely on veteran back on Nick Foles, the veteran backup QB who had been on many stops during his NFL career. But in spite of that, they didn't miss a beat. They won their last 2 out of 3 games to finish 13-3. They won the NFC East crown, and they had the number 1 seed in the NFC. And they were definitely firing on all cylinders on offense as they finished 7th in offense, averaging 365 yards per game. They finished 13th in passing, averaging 233 passing yards per game. They finished 3rd in rushing, averaging 132 rushing yards per game. They finished 1st in passing touchdowns, which they had 38 passing touchdowns, averaged out to 2.3 passing touchdowns per game. They finished 24th in rushing touchdowns, which they had nine rushing touchdowns, which averaged out to 1 point rushing touchdowns per game. And they finished 3rd in points, which they averaged 28 points per game. But they also had a pretty dominant defense that was anchored by Malcolm Jenkins, who had won a Super Bowl with the Saints, and also Fletcher Cox. They finished top 10 in almost every defensive category. They were 4th in defense, which they gave up only 306 yards per game, but they were 7th in pass defense, giving up 227 passing yards per game. But they were 1st in rush defense, giving up only a whopping 79 rushing yards per game. They were fourth in points allowed, giving up only 18 points per game, but they finished 15th in sacks, which they ended up with 38 sacks, which averaged out to 2.3 sacks per game. And they finished fourth in takeaways, which they created 31 takeaways. Now, heading into the playoffs, a lot of people had their apprehensions about the Eagles due to the fact that they were rolling into the playoffs with a journeyman quarterback. They were wondering if Foles could definitely lead this team to a Super Bowl appearance, or would he fold under the lights? Now, of course, the Eagles had the first round bye due to them being the number 1 seed. And in the divisional round, they took on the Atlanta Falcons. And this was a hard-fought game. As a matter of fact, it came down to the wire. The Falcons definitely were definitely a pesky team. They definitely didn't quit. Of course, they were just in the Super Bowl the year before, and we all know what happened in the Super Bowl. But the Falcons, they started off with a 10-0 lead. But then the Eagles went on to score 15 unanswered points, and the Eagles held off the Falcons for a 15-10 win, as the Falcons were in position right at the goal line to win it, and Ryan's pass to Julio Jones went incomplete. And now they advanced to the NFC Championship game to play the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings, they were coming off a hard-fought win in the divisional round, thanks to that was now dubbed as the Minneapolis Miracle, as Stephon Diggs got a hell of a pass to the end zone against the Saints, as they won it with as time expired. But the Eagles would go on to dominate the Vikings for a 38-7 win and make it back to the Super Bowl for the first time, since the 2005 season. And a former adversary stood in their way between them and the Lombardi, and that's the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots had beaten Donovan McNabb, T.O., and that Eagles team in the Super Bowl a few years before. But the Eagles were looking for redemption, and also you had a couple of former Patriots in Long and Blount who wanted to get payback by beating their former team in the Super Bowl and get rings of their own and get another ring outside of Tom Brady and the Patriots. And they were massive underdogs in this Super Bowl due to the fact that Nick Foles was the starting quarterback, and they were going against Tom Brady and the Patriots, who were a dynasty, who had just won the Super Bowl the previous year, looking for the repeat. But the Eagles definitely weren't intimidated. In fact, they embraced the challenge. And they came into the Super Bowl. Well, they started the Super Bowl firing on all cylinders. In fact, by the second quarter, they had a 22-9 lead on the Patriots, and the Eagles were just firing on all cylinders in that Super Bowl. thanks to one of the most iconic trick plays in Super Bowl history, the Philly special. I'm about to show it to you now. Now, this was a play that they had ran in practice earlier that week. They hadn't ran this play all year, and Doug Peterson made a very gutsy call to run it. Here we go. As the pass was made to Foles in the end zone from Trey Burton to Nick Foles for a touchdown to extend the lead for the Eagles. Right, there we go. My apologies. But that was a gutsy call right there by Doug Peterson and his coaching staff. As I mentioned, they had only practiced that play the week of the Super Bowl. They had never practiced it all season. And Peterson decided to pull out the Philly special here in the Super Bowl, and it paid off. And it's one of the most iconic plays in Super Bowl history. But of course, you got Tom Brady on the other side of that, on the other sideline, and the Patriots would come back with 14 unanswered points here in the third quarter. And then a touchdown in the fourth quarter made it a single-digit game. And it looked like the Patriots were driving down the field to take the lead. But the fumble, it was Brandon Graham with the sack fumble on Brady that ended up sealing the game. That ended up basically sealing the game for the Eagles as Foles drove down the field. It led to a field goal by Elliott that extended the lead for the Eagles, and the Eagles ended up holding off the Patriots to win their first Super Bowl in franchise history. They have finally got the monkey off their back after dealing with so many playoff failures as well as Super Bowl failures. The Eagles finally got it done, and they were crowned Super Bowl champs. LeGarrette Blount and Chris Long ended up getting their Super Bowl ring, ended up winning their Super Bowl title outside of the Patriots. So they definitely proved to everyone that they made the right decision by leaving a dynasty in the Patriots and going off to Philly. Nick Foles was named Super Bowl MVP, rightfully so, as he had a monster game. He finished with 373 yards, 3 touchdowns, an interception, a receiving touchdown with 106 QBR rating. Also, LeGarrette Blount, he had a great game. He had 14 carries for 90 yards and a touchdown. Nelson Aguilar, he finished with, 84 yards. But Corey Clement, he had a monster game. He finished with 100 yards and a touchdown. Also, Alshon Jeffrey had 73 yards and a touchdown. This was just a dominating performance by Nick Foles, as Nick Foles, after all these years of being a journeyman quarterback, finally got his opportunity to play in the Super Bowl, and he took full advantage of it. And not only he showed up, he showed out. But this Eagles team got this ranking because how underrated their run was. Also, they were huge underdogs for the rest of the season and in the playoffs, and as well as in the Super Bowl. No one thought that the Eagles would win it with Nick Foles, who had been on various teams throughout his whole career, hadn't had much success, but the Eagles team and the Eagles coaching staff believed in him, and he definitely rewarded their belief by having a dominant playoff run and having some pretty good games to close out the season. And he stepped up on the biggest stage, which was the Super Bowl, and delivered in more ways than one. Also, the Eagles defense definitely doesn't get the props they deserve either, because, man, they had some dudes on that defense. Had Malcolm Jenkins, Fletcher Cox, Brandon Ingram. In my opinion, Fletcher Cox is very underrated. Chris Long was pretty good. As well as Corey Graham. Jalen Mills, the corner. Ronald Darby. Both of them were a hell of a cornerback duo. Also, the Eagles definitely just don't get the props for the run they had, especially with a backup QB. It's very rare that a team wins the Super Bowl with a backup quarterback. Very rare. And that was the first time since Jeff Hostetler led the Giants to the Super Bowl title that a backup QB led a team to the Super Bowl. So I think the Eagles, the 2017 Eagles, should be appreciated a lot more for what they accomplished, especially under some tremendous odds after they lost Carson Wentz for the rest of the season.